We don't need you anymore, Margaret. The words hit me like ice water at my son's baby shower. My daughter-in-law Amber stood there, champagne flute in hand, surrounded by her Boston socialite friends, all watching with barely concealed smirks. 5 years of depleting my teacher's retirement fund, $45,000 for their wedding at the Nantucket Yacht Club, another $30,000 toward their Cape Cod down payment, the checks I'd written with trembling hands, eating store-brand food while they posted Instagram photos from Aspen. I felt the room spinning, my chest tightening as 30 pairs of eyes watched me, the small-town Maine kindergarten teacher who wasn't sophisticated enough for their world. In that moment, something snapped inside me. What happened next left the entire room in shock. I reached for my purse, pulled out my checkbook, and made a decision that would change everything. Not just for Amber and my son, but for the grandchild I'd been so excited to meet. I never imagined becoming the villain in my own family story. But sometimes standing up for yourself means being willing to tear everything down. I'd spent 28 years building a life around my son Jason. When his father Tom walked out to find himself in Colorado with his 20-something secretary, I was left alone with a 4-year-old boy and a mountain of debt in our little house in Kennebunk. We survived on my kindergarten teacher's salary, careful budgeting, and the occasional summer job waiting tables at the lobster shack down by the harbor. Despite everything, we had a good life. Jason was a bright, kind boy who excelled in school. Every parent-teacher conference, I'd sit proudly as they told me what a wonderful young man he was becoming. I still remember the smell of pine trees and salt water as we'd walk home afterward, stopping for our tradition of splitting a chocolate milkshake at Downing's Dairy Bar. By the time Jason earned a scholarship to Boston University, I thought we'd weathered the worst life could throw at us. I'd worked extra summer school sessions for years to build a modest college fund, enough to cover what his scholarship didn't. The day I dropped him off at his dorm, I cried the entire 3-hour drive home, proud tears mixed with the bittersweet knowledge that our little team of 2 was changing forever. In his junior year, Jason called me, voice bubbling with excitement. "Mom, I've met someone amazing. Her name is Amber Whitfield." The Whitfields. Even in Maine, we knew that name. Old Boston money, summer homes in Martha's Vineyard, connections to everyone who mattered in New England. When I first met Amber at their favorite Boston bistro, she was polished and poised in a way I'd never be, with her Ivy League education and perfect blonde highlights. Her parents couldn't make it, tied up with charity board meetings, she explained. Still, I tried. I brought a handmade quilt for their apartment, something my grandmother had taught me to make. Amber thanked me with a tight smile before tucking it away in a closet. "It doesn't really match our aesthetic," she later told Jason, not realizing I could hear from the kitchen where I was washing dishes after cooking them dinner. When they announced their engagement a year later, I remortgaged my house. The wedding they wanted, Amber wanted, was beyond anything I could have imagined. Jason looked uncomfortable when I showed him the check, but Amber's eyes lit up. "You're such a dear, Margaret," she said, the first time she'd seemed genuinely pleased with me. "We'll make sure you have a special seat at the mother of the groom table." I sold my mother's pearls to buy a dress that wouldn't embarrass them among Amber's country club friends. At the rehearsal dinner, Amber's father Richard stood up and spoke about how proud he was to welcome Jason into their family. "We've got big plans for this young man at the firm," he announced, clapping my son on the shoulder. Jason had never mentioned changing his plans to work in environmental law to join Whitfield Financial. Later that night, I overheard Amber's mother Bitsy talking to another elegant woman in the bathroom. The mother's sweet, but so provincial. Jason's clearly trying to climb the ladder. Can't blame him, coming from, well, you know. I flew home the day after the wedding with a piece of cake wrapped in a napkin and a hollow feeling in my chest. 3 months later, Jason called to say they'd found the perfect starter home on Cape Cod. The price tag made me gasp. "We just need a little help with the down payment, Mom," he said, his voice carrying that same uncomfortable tone. Amber's parents are covering most of it, but they think it would be good for us to have some skin in the game too. I took out a home equity loan and sent another check. When they announced the pregnancy 6 months later, I started putting aside a little each month for the baby. My grandchild would have everything I couldn't give Jason. "We're going to set up a proper trust fund," Amber told me during one of our awkward monthly phone calls. "But we could use some seed money to get it started right." I stopped coloring my hair at the salon and started using a box dye from the drugstore. I canceled my basic cable package. I started shopping at the discount grocery store across town. Each sacrifice was worth it for my growing family. And then came the day of the baby shower, the day everything would finally change. The invitation arrived in a pale blue envelope, addressed in perfect calligraphy. "A celebration of new life," it read, with a watercolor stork carrying a bundle. The shower would be held at the Whitfields' summer home in Chatham, a sprawling Cape Cod colonial overlooking the Atlantic that had been featured in Architectural Digest last spring. I spent weeks searching for the perfect gift, not just any gift, something that would finally make Amber see me as worthy. I settled on a silver baby rattle from Tiffany's, spending far more than I should have. I also prepared an envelope containing a check, the remainder of my savings account for the baby's college fund. The morning of the shower, I woke at 4 a.m. to make the drive from Maine. My ancient Toyota Camry with 187,000 miles on it struggled on the highway, making a concerning rattle that I'd been ignoring for months. I couldn't afford repairs, not after everything else. I arrived an hour early, nervous about finding parking among what would surely be a sea of luxury vehicles. A valet in a crisp uniform approached as I pulled up. "I can park myself," I said quickly, embarrassed by my car among the BMWs and Range Rovers. "All vehicles must use valet service, ma'am," he replied with practiced politeness. "Mrs. Whitfield's instructions." Inside, event staff in black and white attire were putting final touches on elaborate floral arrangements. Crystal champagne flutes sparkled on trays. In the center of the grand room stood a table piled high with exquisitely wrapped gifts, many with recognizable luxury store packaging. Amber's mother Bitsy spotted me and air-kissed near my cheeks. "Margaret, you made it. How determined of you to drive all that way." She glanced at my simple blue dress, the nicest thing I owned, and smiled tightly. "We're keeping this intimate, just 60 or so of our closest friends." I wasn't seated at the main table with the other family members, but at a side table with distant cousins and Amber's former roommate's mother. The seating card read Mrs. rather than grandmother, like the cards for Amber's parents. As guests arrived, women in designer sundresses with perfect blowouts, I noticed Jason working the room, laughing too loudly, dropping names of partners at Whitfield Financial. He came to my table briefly, kissing my cheek. "You doing okay, Mom?" he asked, eyes darting around the room. "Of course, honey. Everything's beautiful." "Great, great." He squeezed my shoulder. "Hey, listen, Dad called yesterday." My stomach dropped. "Your father?" What did he want? He's back in Boston, doing really well now. Executive position at Suffolk Mutual. Jason lowered his voice. He asked about the baby. I think he wants to be involved. Before I could respond, he was pulled away by Richard Whitfield to meet the governor's wife, just stopped by for a minute. I sat alone, picking at a tiny quiche, watching as Amber opened gift after gift. A silver-plated high chair from her sorority sisters, a designer diaper bag that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, baby clothes from French boutiques. During a lull in the festivities, I approached Amber with my small blue box and envelope. She was surrounded by her friends from Wellesley, all of them looking like they'd stepped out of a catalog. "This is for the baby," I said, handing her my offerings, "and this check is for the college fund we discussed." She opened the box, lifting the silver rattle with a practiced smile. "How traditional. Thank you, Margaret." Then she opened the envelope, glancing at the check before folding it quickly. One of her friends leaned in, whispering something that made Amber laugh. "Is everything okay?" I asked. "It's fine," Amber said, placing my gifts aside without showing them to the room, like she had with the others. "You really shouldn't have, especially with your situation." "What situation?" She lowered her voice. "Jason told me about your mortgage problems. We appreciate the gesture, but it's hardly necessary. Richard has already set up a trust fund that will cover our child's education through graduate school." My cheeks burned. I wanted to contribute. That's what grandmothers do. Amber's perfectly plucked eyebrow arched. "About that, we've been discussing family roles, and we think it's better if the baby calls you Margaret instead of Grandma. Bitsy will be grandmother, of course. We just think it's less confusing that way." I felt as if I'd been slapped. Less confusing? Well, you're so far away in Maine, and with your teaching schedule, we don't anticipate you being very involved day to day. "I'm retiring next year. I was planning to help with the baby." She patted my arm condescendingly. "That's sweet, but we've already hired a nanny. Bitsy found her. She worked for the Cabots before they moved to London." I struggled to keep my voice steady. "Jason didn't mention any of this." "Men," she laughed dismissively. "They never communicate the details, do they?" And then she said it, leaning in close so no one else would hear, champagne on her breath. "We don't need you anymore, Margaret. The money was helpful while Jason was establishing himself, but he's part of the Whitfield family now. We've got everything handled." She turned back to her friends as if she hadn't just shattered my world. I stood there, frozen, clutching my purse strap as the room seemed to tilt around me. Across the room, I saw Jason laughing with his father, my ex-husband Tom, who I hadn't seen in 24 years, and who apparently now warranted an invitation while I was being cast aside. That's when something inside me broke. I'm not sure what came over me in that moment. Maybe it was seeing Tom there, silver-haired and prosperous-looking in his tailored suit, after all those years of struggle. Maybe it was the realization that I'd been nothing but an ATM to the son I'd sacrificed everything for. Or maybe it was simply that after decades of putting everyone else first, something in me finally demanded to be heard. I walked to the center of the room, right next to the elaborate diaper cake centerpiece that probably cost more than my monthly salary. My hands were shaking, but my voice was surprisingly steady when I spoke. "Excuse me, everyone. I'd like to say something about my grandchild." The room quieted, faces turning toward me with curious expressions. Amber froze mid-conversation, her champagne flute halfway to her lips. I saw Jason's eyes widen in alarm as he started moving toward me. "First, I want to thank the Whitfields for this lovely party." I smiled tightly at Bitsy, who was already looking to the event coordinator with a panicked expression. It's certainly grander than anything I could have provided on a kindergarten teacher's salary. A few uncomfortable laughs rippled through the crowd. For those who don't know me, I'm Margaret Walsh. I raised Jason as a single mother after his father decided family life wasn't exciting enough for him. I looked directly at Tom, who had the decency to look down at his shoes. I worked 3 jobs some summers to make sure Jason had everything he needed. I helped him with homework, nursed him through chickenpox, and taught him to drive in the Hannaford parking lot at dawn so he wouldn't be nervous. I opened my purse and pulled out my checkbook, along with a small notebook I always carried. I've kept track of every check I've written since Jason and Amber got engaged. The wedding, $45,000. The down payment assistance, $30,000. The honeymoon to Bali, $12,000. Furniture for the new house, $18,000. I flipped through the pages. In total, $127,842. Money I took from my retirement fund, from a second mortgage, from loans I'm still paying off. The room was completely silent now. I could see Amber's friends exchanging glances. Jason was frozen in place, his face drained of color. I was happy to help. That's what mothers do. But I've just been informed by my daughter-in-law that, and I quote, "We don't need you anymore." I looked directly at Amber. Apparently, I'm not even going to be allowed to be called grandma. Gasps and murmurs spread through the room. Even Bitsy Whitfield looked uncomfortable. So, I've decided to take Amber at her word. I tore a check from my checkbook and held it up. This check is for $127,842. It represents every penny I've given, which I now understand was just a stopgap until Jason was fully absorbed into the Whitfield family. I turned to face my son directly. Jason, I've endorsed the deed to your childhood home over to you as well. You can sell it, keep it, whatever you want. I'll be moving into a smaller place next month anyway. Jason started, "Mom, wait!" I'm not finished. My voice cracked slightly, but I pressed on. I want you to know that I don't regret a single sacrifice I made for you. But I do regret that I somehow raised a man who would stand by while his mother was treated as an embarrassing inconvenience. I placed the check on the gift table. Consider this my baby shower gift. Apparently, it's all I was ever good for anyway. The room erupted in whispers. Amber's face had gone from shocked to furious. Bitsy was already making her way toward me, social damage control in full effect. But it was Tom who reached me first, his expression unreadable. "Maggie," he said quietly, using the nickname he'd abandoned along with us 2 decades ago. I held up my hand. "Don't. You lost the right to call me that when you walked out on your 4-year-old son." I turned to the room one last time. "Congratulations on the baby. I truly hope he or she grows up understanding the difference between price and value." With that, I walked out, past the valet stand and to my rattling Toyota. I started the engine with shaking hands and pulled away from the magnificent house, leaving behind the life I thought I was building and the family I thought I had. It wasn't until I reached the highway that the tears finally came. The aftermath was immediate and chaotic. My phone exploded with calls and texts before I'd even reached the Massachusetts state line. Jason called 17 times. I let them all go to voicemail, needing space to process what I'd done. For the first time in decades, I'd put myself first, and it felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. 3 days later, I was boxing up classroom supplies in my empty school. Summer break had just started when I heard footsteps in the doorway. I turned to find Jason standing there, looking as lost as he had when he was 5 and couldn't find me at the grocery store. "Mom," he said simply, his voice breaking. I set down the construction paper I was organizing. "How did you find me?" "You've been teaching in the same classroom for 15 years. He attempted a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Can we talk?" We sat at the tiny student desks, his adult frame looking absurd in the chair designed for 10-year-olds. For a while, neither of us spoke. "I had no idea," he finally said, "about the second mortgage, about how much you'd given us." "You never asked." I kept my voice neutral. "You just assumed Mom would handle it." "Amber told me her parents were covering most of it, that you insisted on helping." He ran his hands through his hair. "God, I've been such an idiot." "Where is Amber now?" "At her parents'. We had words after you left." He looked down at his hands. Everyone was talking. Her college roommate actually came up to me and said she'd never seen someone treat their mother-in-law so poorly. Apparently, Amber had been bragging about how she had you wrapped around her finger. I felt a vindication I wasn't proud of. "And your father? What was he doing there?" Jason winced. "Amber invited him. She thought it would be good for me to reconnect. She didn't tell me until he arrived." "Convenient timing, now that he's successful again." "He wants to see you, Mom. He said watching you walk out was like seeing the last 24 years flash before his eyes, all the moments he missed." I laughed bitterly. He chose to miss them. We sat in silence again. Outside, the school maintenance crew was mowing the field for graduation. "I don't know what happens now," Jason admitted. "Everything's a mess. Amber's furious. Her parents are embarrassed. The baby's coming in 3 months, and I don't even know if my marriage will survive that long." "That's not my problem to solve anymore," I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. "I know." He nodded slowly. "But I need to ask, was it all just about the money? Are you really cutting me off completely?" I studied my son's face, the little boy I'd raised, now a man I barely recognized. "The money was never the point, Jason. It was that you let someone push me out of your life and the life of my grandchild without a second thought." He flinched. "I didn't realize that's what was happening." "Didn't you?" I asked softly. The next few weeks were a blur. I put my house on the market and found a small apartment near the coast. I told the school board I'd be retiring at the end of the next school year. For the first time, I started thinking about what I wanted. A week after my confrontation at the baby shower, a check arrived in the mail, the exact amount I'd demanded, signed by Richard Whitfield himself. There was no note. I didn't cash it. Instead, I called my bank and set up a trust fund in the name of Baby Walsh Whitfield, pointedly using both family names. I deposited the check there, along with what little savings I had left. The baby might never know me as Grandma, but someday they would know I had thought of them. A month after the shower, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Amber standing there, her baby bump more pronounced now, looking uncomfortable and out of place on my modest porch. "May I come in?" she asked, none of her usual confidence in her voice. We sat in my kitchen, the same table where Jason had done his homework for years. Amber declined tea, fidgeting with her wedding ring. "I've been seeing a therapist," she said abruptly. "After everything happened, my parents insisted." I waited, saying nothing. She thinks I have issues with authenticity and control. Amber looked up at me. She asked me why I felt so threatened by you. And what did you tell her? That you had something I never had, a son who actually loved you for yourself, not for what you could provide. Her voice cracked. My parents have always measured love in dollar signs and connections. I thought that was normal. I felt a twinge of empathy despite myself. That doesn't excuse how you treated me. No, it doesn't. She placed her hand on her stomach. But I don't want my child growing up thinking that's how we treat family. I don't want to be the villain in their story. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was a beginning. 2 months later, I was there when Emma Margaret Walsh Whitfield came into the world, a tiny, red-faced miracle with Jason's nose and Amber's determined chin. I stood awkwardly in the hospital room, unsure of my place, until Amber beckoned me closer. "Would you like to hold your granddaughter?" she asked, emphasizing the word. The baby was warm and perfect in my arms. Whatever happened between the adults, I knew in that moment that this child would never doubt she was loved. Life settled into a new rhythm. Jason and Amber stayed together, working through their issues in couples therapy. I maintained boundaries I should have established years ago. My little apartment by the sea became my sanctuary. I started volunteering at the local maritime museum, discovering a passion for local history I never knew I had. Tom called occasionally. We met for coffee once, an awkward encounter full of apologies that came 25 years too late. I didn't hate him anymore, but I had no interest in rekindling anything. Some bridges stay burned. The most unexpected development came 6 months after Emma's birth. Richard Whitfield called me directly, something that had never happened before. "Margaret," he said in his clipped Boston accent, "I've been following your work at the Maritime Museum. Impressive stuff, that research on the local fishing industry." "Thank you," I replied, confused by the call. "We're setting up a cultural heritage foundation. Need someone with your authenticity to head up the education component. Pays well, complete creative control." I almost laughed at the irony. "Are you offering me a job, Richard?" "More like a partnership," he replied. "Sometimes it takes someone willing to walk away from the table to earn a proper seat at it." I took the position, not for the money, though the salary was more than I'd ever earned teaching, but for the chance to build something meaningful on my own terms. Emma is 2 now. She calls me Gamma Maggie and Bitsy Gamma Bits, a toddler-speak compromise that somehow works for everyone. Jason and Amber have found their own path, one that includes both families, but with clearer boundaries. As for the check I dramatically demanded at the baby shower, it's still in that trust fund, untouched. Emma will get it on her 21st birthday, along with a letter explaining its complicated history. Some lessons are worth passing down. Looking back at that day at the baby shower, I sometimes barely recognize the woman who stood up and demanded to be valued. After decades of silent sacrifice, finding my voice changed everything. Not just my relationship with Jason and Amber, but how I view myself. The truth is, we teach people how to treat us by what we accept. For too long, I accepted being the backstage supporter, the silent benefactor, the grandmother in waiting who would take whatever role was assigned to her. Now, as I watch little Emma playing in the tide pools near my coastal apartment, pointing excitedly at tiny hermit crabs and sea stars, I realize that standing up for myself gave her something precious too, a grandmother who knows her own worth. Family isn't just about blood or obligation. It's about mutual respect and recognizing each person's value beyond what they can provide materially. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and others is to draw a line and say, "This is what I deserve." If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And I'd love to hear in the comments about a time when you had to stand up for yourself in your own family. Remember, it's never too late to rewrite the rules of your relationships, even if it means causing a scene at a baby shower.